Welcome, everyone. This is the BioFi community of practice. We're so happy to have y'all here, and we're so grateful to have our two guests from Grassroots Economics here to present on their work and engage in conversation with you all. Before I introduce them and turn it over, just want to ground us in who we are here and what we're doing together. What is the space that you've showed up to in case it's your first time? This is the BioFi community of practice. And we're an online network and geographically dispersed community that uses a high-low platform to organize ourselves. And our purpose here is to cultivate and support a global community of practitioners who are designing, capitalizing, implementing, and evolving bioregional financing facilities through peer-to-peer learning and coordination. And I trust many of you are touching some aspect of that very diverse field of work. And now I'm just going to head right into introductions of our two guests, Will Ruddick and Aude Péronne. Many of you are probably familiar with both of them and their work, but in case this is your first time, just want to give a little background. Will Ruddick is a development economist and founder of Grassroots Economics Foundation, focused on traditional practices and currency innovation. After graduate school researching high energy physics at the Stanford Linear Accelerator Center, he found his passion drawn to alternative economics and development. Since 2008, Will has lived in East Africa, pioneering community inclusion currency programs in Kenya, and founding the award-winning Sarafu Network and Bangla Pesa programs. His work centers on commitment pooling, an economic protocol rooted in ancestral wisdom that enables communities to coordinate resources, build mutual aid networks, and connect to their own abundance. He consults worldwide and has conducted research with the World Food Program, the Red Cross, and the University of Cape Town's Environmental Economics Policy Research Unit. We're so grateful to have Aude here as well, holding down the other side of the work at Grassroots Economics. Aude Péronne brings 2 decades of experience in ecosystem restoration, permaculture, and community building, facilitating collaborative laboratories at local and global levels in service of earth and water stewardship. At Grassroots Economics Foundation, she develops ecosystem stewardship methodologies inspired by local resource coordination and participatory traditions. She's currently building an ecosystem restoration model farm in Kariba village, connected to 60 households, while linking landscapes across the Kilifi bioregion to develop watershed perspectives grounded in place. Aude also guides community leaders across contexts and climates as part of the global ecosystem restoration movement. So it's a true honor to have them both here today. We've been following them very closely at the BioFi project for some time and see a lot of beautiful synergies here between the work we're trying to uplift with bioregional financing facilities, bioregional regeneration strategies, economic transformation thinking, and exploring modes of exchange and building trust beyond dominant fiat currency systems. And so with that, I'm going to hand it over to Will and Aude. We've asked them a handful of questions that we think would be relevant, and they're going to riff on that for a while. And then we'll have some chance for y'all to ask questions and open up some dialogue later in the day. All right, over to you, Will and Aude.
History.
Hey, everybody. Good to
Hi,
see you.
everyone. Nice to meet you all. Nice to see similar known faces here on the screen.
Yeah.
And super happy and grateful to be with BioFi today.
So a little background. Well, so where do I start? I guess I came into this work that I'm doing now with Grassroots Economics in 2008, really wanting to understand economics in general, like why do we have the world we live in? Why do we interact with each other the way we do? And I thought I joined the Peace Corps. I thought that would be the best way to learn economics. And in some ways, I just felt like I couldn't see beyond the economy around me in the US. And somehow like just getting out of that gave me a lot of perspective. And then I originally kind of fell in love with the idea of like community currencies and the idea that money was something designable and really money focused. And it took me about maybe 10-ish years to kind of decentralize or defocus on money and kind of move sort of away from ideas like individual credits and currencies and whatnot into more like what is the space that holds flows and enables relationality and trust to build. And like the money's still an element within all of that. We'll talk more about that, I guess. But and then 3 years ago, well, I started focusing on ecology. We got trained on like syntropic agroforestry years back, and that became a really kind of like a core part of our work. But we didn't really have any expertise in that exactly. We kept bringing in trainers, and we finally met Aude to come and help us with that work about 3.5 years ago. And yeah, we fell in love with her. I fell in love with her, and we're about to have a baby in a month. So we're here with her family in France right now. So it's exciting. And then maybe just recently as well, that like we've been sort of invited to work with the government of Bhutan, and we've been working a lot with in places around the other countries, but not really with governments so much. And so that's been changing our perspective a lot in terms of what's possible when like there's kind of like regulatory approval and all this kind of stuff that is not always easy in some places, especially dealing with financial systems. So that's been a big shift for us. And yeah, I'll let you go.
Yeah. Yeah, so for me, on like the other side of the perspective, when I went to Kenya 3.5 years ago, I met the work of Grassroots Economics on the ground. And after 20 years working in different contexts, in different cultures, and in different communities, I was always finding a same gap in economical system that really sustain and grab together the social aspect, the ecological aspect, and how we really weave an economy that has different values. And so I kind of experimented that for 20 years in different communities, grassroots movements, grassroots groups. And when I got to know more real and grassroots economics, I really saw what we're going to talk about today as well, which is commitment pooling, philosophy and methodology. For me, it really filled the gap that I had seen in many places. But we're going to go again through the questions with Tyler and Samantha. We're gonna go through that. Yeah. So, yeah. Do you want to address the questions yourself, Tyler and Samantha?
I can, yeah, I
Yeah?
can.
Okay.
Yeah, so I think one of the first things we'd love to clear up is I think I often hear people referring to your work as mutual credit, and I know you all like to frame it differently, and I think it'd be really helpful to explain that difference in frame.
Go for it.
Yeah, we should start with that.
Well, so mutual credit isn't all that well defined in some cases, but it's basically kind of like an accounting view. I see Leanne on the call. She could answer this quite well. But basically, if you're looking at exchanging with someone and saying, I've given you some carrots, and therefore, I've got sort of like plus 10 points, and you've got minus 10 points. That's sort of like zero sum accounting for credit and debt across two people who have agreed on the value of something to say, what's the relative debt or credit anyone's in. Like that sort of accounting can apply to all kinds of stuff. You can apply kind of zero sum accounting to bank loans or how many seeds have you put in a seed bank or anything like that. So you can look at it as a frame for accounting mutual credit. What we're focused a lot on is, and those frames are useful for what we're doing as well. But usually what we're looking at is how do people pool resources, right? So like you could look at mutual credit as the accounting system for a frame around a seed bank, but that doesn't really tell you much about the seeds in the seed bank or what is the relationship between all the people going on in that seed bank. It gives you sort of some sort of like flat view, accounting view of what's going on. And so when we're working with community groups, a lot of the time we're really just trying to understand what are the actual resources in the community of all kinds. And we can go into that more, but we do a lot of like asset mapping, resource mapping, relationship mapping. And then we look at what are sort of the commitments people can make or have make or do make for those resources, right? So it's like I can provide, apples, for instance, or teaching or labor. Like how does that trust in that get stored? And so when we say commitment pooling, we're talking instead of like physical resource pooling, we're talking about like pooling of commitments for resources. And you can imagine a commitment being anything like a voucher or a gift card, some sort of formalized thing, but it could also just be how we give our word and how we hold reputation with each other. And so that structure of a pool of commitments, and then we use the term pool a lot because it's, kind of reminiscent of Eleanor Ostrom's work, like common pooled resources. But this is more talking about like intangible pools, right? What is a pool of commitments really look like exactly? And I think this is, what we found for the last few years, at least, is just that this is just a common pattern we find around individuals and groups of individuals and groups of groups where there's some kind of agreement, some kind of a commitment being held between parties, even like a work contract, right? There's a commitment to be paid and there's a commitment to provide labor, let's say, right? Those are being held together, sometimes in a formal contract, and that contract will have a bunch of parameters to it. It would say, what is the relative value of those things? So the first thing that's been done is to say what's valuable to that group, right? Whether it's two people, like what are those things that they're holding in value? The next is to say, how do they value those things? And there's a lot of ways to do that against common units of account or relative values. We can talk more about that as well. And then there's also limits on that as well, like how much labor would be accepted for the money coming in. Or if I was borrowing from you, how much can I possibly borrow before I need to repay? And, so what are those various limits that keep kind of safeguards in that system? And then how is that exchange being done, right? Is there a schedule to it? Are there fees on that? Are you paying taxes with it, right? So that's kind of like the four elements that we sort of like minimally look for in like a resource coordination protocol. We say, okay, we're coordinating what resources, how are those things expressed as commitments? What are their values? How do we value them, even relative to each other or anything? How do we limit them in terms of reciprocity? How much can be exchanged of anyone? And then how is that exchange actually performed? And so you could look at a pool of those things and say, okay, well, Will has put in one, and now Aude is going to borrow that. She's going to put in one of her own commitments of some equal value and pull out Will's commitment, like a gift card, and then use it with him, for instance. And we can measure that in a system that has zero some accounting. And we could call that now the accounting layer. We can say that's a mutual credit-like accounting layer, right? And I guess what I've found in when we create mutual credit systems like as the thing that you're making, you often miss a lot of those other layers. You're just like, okay, we've given everyone 100 points, and now when she does something, I get more points, and like that sort of like flattens things out, and it creates this sort of assumption that there is actual commitments of real resources. And so what if there aren't? And so like usually we're trying to start from that little bit lower level and say, well, what's actually real in that community as close as we can get? And then the accounting layers kind of come later. I don't know if that's, yeah. If you're familiar with like a permablitz, for instance, if you're into permaculture, Like if Aude is running a permablitz, you say, okay, everyone's going to come to Aude's to go and help her with gardening, or composting, whatever she's doing that day. And in some sense, she is now in debt to us. If there was an expectation of the group that it's going to be a rotation of these permablitzes, now she's kind of expected to come and help with the other permablitzes, right? And so in a way, if we all come to her place first, she's in a bit of debt to us and we all have a bit of credit, right? We could also look at that as a mutual credit layer, right? That's a way of accounting for, whatever it is that we find important in that situation. And that could be dollar value, it could be time value, it could be denominated in a million different ways. And yeah, let me pause there.
That's wonderful.
Maybe just adding on that, like, whereas the mutual credit aspect of it is like more like accounting. We can account for who has done what. In the commitment pooling, when this becomes a cycle that goes over and over again and continues through time, then we realize that there's a lot of agreements behind. There's a governance layer on it that's really strong. And that sometimes gets missed in just like accounting. Oh, you gave me that, I gave you that. But then what happens? And that's also something I've seen in a lot of grassroots structures, like great, we give and receive, but then it's like, okay, how we make that sustainable, how it really becomes a system that we can carry on, that we know that there are some people taking more or the less, because we need balance, like as in nature, we need balance. In social system, we need balance. We need balance in what we give or receive, otherwise at some point resources drain or personal energy drains, So that's just what I would add on that.
Looking at that, the accounting layer, where is the imbalance?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
It's super strong to see how, like all our neighbors in Kenya, we have a little community center there, and to see all the mechanisms they have to actually see, hey, who has really reciprocated. And there's a lot of ways to ask for forgiveness, or to show up another day, or to do extra work to kind of balance that. That is something really amazing to see. That it's just, there's a huge ledgering and accountability behind. They have their books, where they keep track of how is actually the community reciprocating.
Yeah. So reciprocity, like fairness, accountability, and getting into, like from adjectives into verbs and sort of away from the nouns a little bit, because to me, mutual credit's a little bit too much of a noun for me. Like, I want to know, what are you actually doing? What's the operation you're actually doing right now? And I think mutual credit's gotten pulled into a little bit of like a brand terminology, and it's just not clear exactly what that means when everyone's saying it. And I think it's a little bit confusing in that sense. So yeah, like we want accounting, we want fairness, we want to be able to know where to pinpoint imbalances in a system, and you want accounting layers to do that.
Great. Thanks so much for that thorough explanation. Very helpful. So, this community that's gathered here, for the most part, I think that the folks who tend to come on calls frequently and are frequent flyers on these calls, we're all kind of in a North American context for the most part. There's some folks here and there who come in, and our digital community has folks all over the world. But I think a lot of the folks here, they're working in American cities or North American rural regions. And in reading your work and your book, you really highlight the importance of the ancestral memory and the cultural practices of rotational labor in specific communities and villages. And I would love to learn a bit more about, in the communities that you've been working there in Kenya, what does the most robust commitment pool look like today? What sort of value is flowing? How has that been evolving? And then help us in a different kind of North American context where we might not have that same cultural memory of rotational labor. We might be, walled off from central gathering spaces in certain communities. We might have a more consumerist culture. We may not all be farmers that can easily go and help each other out on the land. Help us kind of translate the work into this context and imagine what you're seeing is already being done in a context like this, or how you would imagine those same methodologies applying.
Maybe I start a bit. Yeah. So basically what Will has been studying and focusing more and more on to understand, okay, how do we build new economical system is on how, as humans, wherever we are, have done that. Like before capitalism, before the introduction of money, how are we operating as a human species, right? Beyond where we live. And so if I don't know if some of you have looked at the book, but we will share again the link at the end of the book. There is a list of those practices all over the world. Even I'm from here in Normandy, in northern France, and that was existing to the generation of my brothers and sisters. Though you would still have collective days. We are in a rural context here where you would go and harvest and not go to school that day. And I'm talking about that like 40 years ago, 40 to 50 years ago, like you wouldn't go to school. A teacher would understand because that was the day of doing the big harvest or making the apple cider, and and everyone would gather and everyone would have a meal that day, and that was somehow part of education, and that's not so far away, and we are in the context of France. So for me, that's something that's really relevant, is saying like, as humans, how are we behaving? And we see that across the United States as well. Look, we see that everywhere. That's a pattern that for me, when I saw that, I was like, oh, wow, that makes sense. What is still within us, within our DNA as humans, carrying that. And so, yes, it's true that then we have some countries where this is still alive or almost disappearing, and in some country where we have disconnected more from that. But as soon as when we are somewhere, we can pick that wherever it is, 50, 60, 70 years back or 100 years back, it's still somewhere in some written text, in some memories of children, of people, and pull this back, doing that investigation around, because everywhere we go, we find information on that.
Yeah.
It's really like a historical work or research work kind of, but you can really find something on that. And we keep receiving from people over the world, oh, I found out around me, like, so that's one layer of it. And then another layer is that the way I'm seeing it is that, yeah, those systems were really anchored in like really integrated living systems, and now we've degraded as a society, we've degraded the environment, like there is a degradation. And what I'm seeing is that there are more now modern ways. I would even mention permaculture. I'm a big permaculturist in that sense, as a more modern way of addressing all of that. Will was talking about permablitzes. Permaculture has also researched around that, but somehow it's a little modernized way of saying, okay, how we do reorganize ourselves, right, as social ecological mechanisms that are more integrated. And so that's also a work that I like doing, is understanding, like, for instance, again, I'm going to take France as an example. It's like, now you have social systems, like we call that associations, association in France, where people just gather to make some gathering happens. There are more modern ways to organize as people. You have like community gardens. That's things you can find in the States. There are many different types of projects like that have the intention of regathering people and rebuilding systems where we share, we coordinate resources. So for me, that's the like old ways and more modern ways. And I would say in those more modern ways, how we try to reinsert that DNA as much as we can, like really that's the way I'm really looking at that now. It's right, we have modern ways now, but I'm also seeing some systems that are even like association in France or any other type of model that are too economically focused. So it's like how we rebuild the loop within the system to actually get back to this essence of reciprocity and really like doing something that's for the good of all, for the good of us as society. And that's a big mindset of changing our ways to relate with economy, our own economies, the economies around us, and go through it.
Yeah, I like that. So like there's a big like human narrative around how did we care for each other and exchange with each other and what did that look like? And so that's just, like I when you come into, like economics or from whatever angle you're coming into, like what we're sort of taught usually is that like transactional barter, like someone would like directly trade a fish for some water or something like that was the origin of economics. And that just turns out to not be true at all. There was always some kind of borrowing going on, and I use the word borrowing like if you're familiar with like gift economies, like the idea is not that you're just like giving to people, it's that like there is some long tail reciprocity going on within that ecosystem. And so the idea that like one person within a village or a family can say, I need help from everyone. I need to borrow, if you will. I mean, I'm using that in sort of a modern version of the word, but I need everyone to come and help me. And yes, there's some intention that I'm going to reciprocate. I'm going to be grateful of that and give back. And the specific tradition, like we hear about gift economies and whatnot, but like the very specific traditions of them do involve things like everything that Eleanor Ostrom would talk about, like graduated sanctions, for instance. Like there would be stages at which people would say, look, you're no longer going to be given to by this community. We're not going to come help you anymore unless at some point you're going to bring back, then there would have to be a bunch of traditions around where we live in Kenya, like bring a goat and a chicken and have a feast and say sorry, explain whatever happened. And so there'd be all kinds of different sort of like traditions around forgiveness and coming back in and healing, like not with the intention of punishment, but with the intention of fixing um, that. Yeah, there's an article I just wrote kind of on that because I was reading Braiding Sweetgrass again and Serviceberry and when Kimmer talks about gifts, she's almost always putting them hand in hand with some form of gratitude and reciprocity. Right. It's not like the Christmas present kind of gift where you just like give it away and it's gone. And there's a lot of the cultures around where we are as well, like that would say that you can't even accept a gift or even a donation unless you actually have a relationship with that person and clear intentions and whatnot. So anyway, there's a whole bunch of traditions around that. And but part of the thing around indebtedness is that there would be some way within that indebtedness, like if Aude does something great for me or she gives me some money or some resources where I'm indebted to her, there'd be some way to make that, instead of bilateral just between us, there'd be some way to make that multilateral. Right. There'd be some way where it says like she's given me this money, she's holding a debt of mine, but she could somehow move that debt back to me, or I repay her some way, or she could move it around the circle. Right. And so in some ways, like she's a lender, right? She's someone who's helped me with my tradition, my muerte or something like this. But so she's lended me her time. She's holding this debt, but she would have some way to say, look, can anyone within this community use that right now? Right. And so like Stuart Cohen can come in and say, look, I need some of Will's time. And he might give Aude some money or resources to repay my debt to her. And then I go and work with Stuart, And so what's happened is that Stuart has he's got a curated marketplace because he trusts Aude. There could be a guarantee involved as well. If he can't get the work from Will, he can give it back to Aude. I get to borrow and pay in kind potentially, and Aude gets to be able to move that debt faster rather than just holding on to it, right? So that's this like triple win, right? It's a win-win-win scenario, right? It's a win for the community because they have some curation on value because Aude gave me a loan, right? And Aude is vouching for some of my services, right? It's a win for her because she was able to have her loan repaid faster, right? And so this is this concept of like velocity of settlement, right? You want settlement to happen quickly because every time there's a loan, the whole point is for loans to be generative, right? That you're actually, like you've borrowed labor as in a permablitz. Well, you're generating a whole bunch of food. You've got more than enough energy and whatnot to go and do the next permablitz, right? And so you want those things to happen more often. Not because you want transactions to be happening, but you want people to, like the economic question here is usually we like to frame it as, how do we coordinate and use all of our resources together to reach our visions? That's the economic question. And so in that case, like, yeah, you want to make sure that debts are not just stuck with people, And so that's a lot of our work is, so like a very simplest way to think about this pattern, like Aude was talking about the DNA. This pattern is like, if you are an e-bike leasing company, and let's say, Patricia comes and says, I'm going to lease an e-bike, electronic, a motorcycle. And they say, okay, great. Now you're in debt to us. You're going to pay back over time, and eventually you're going to own this bike. Say, okay, in the meantime, maybe Patricia is also willing to offer X, Y, and Z. Maybe she does consulting. Maybe she's a taxi driver as well with that e-bike, right? So could that company that's offering the loan create a marketplace where they offer Patricia's e-bike services, right? Where they get a cut of that, and that pays back her lease, right? So that's just it's if that works, when that works, and there's conditionality on when that can work well, when that, and because there's some elements to that are really important. But if that works well, then she pays back her e-bike leasing much faster, right? People get a curated marketplace, right? And she's got the e-bike, and she's eventually paying it off, and we're much more generative in that sense. And then what we're doing in those cycles is that we're building trust, right? You're building this, we use the term social soil a lot, right? Mm-hmm. You're trying to compost and keep moving that soil and create a living substrate within it. And when we're constantly in transaction or gift, or like pure gift, like a donation, a handoff, or just a one-off transaction, you don't build trust. You never go into any form of debt, right? Because you never give anyone the chance to do so. And therefore, how can you ever build trust without that? And that's been a real shift for me in thinking about relational debt rather than, extractive, dominating debt. Yeah.
I have a follow-up question on that. This is all super helpful, Will and Aude, and we have a bunch of questions coming in the chat that we'll bring in shortly. But in this context that we're living in the global north, with rapidly accelerating inequality, do you two see or feel that that is going to bring more people back to these relational ways of getting work done, of resourcing our lives? And are there any examples of that you can note? I really hear you, Aude, that every culture had these practices historically. And I guess I'm wondering, what are some pathways to us returning to them and starting to build those muscles again in places where people did not grow up with that way of resourcing?
Mm-hmm. Well, I can start with that. Like, it's 20 years I've been in different, as I was saying, intentional community, grassroots group. And honestly, in 20 years, I've seen so many groups develop. So many, like permaculture movement, ecosystem restoration movements, lots of places that even just like grassroots entities really developing everywhere around the world. And I think that socially as well, we are getting to a point where there's more and more despair and realization that's needed to do that. And I'm seeing more people within that. The movement has grown like amazingly. I remember at the beginning, we were a few people, it was like, oh, wow, where are the other people? Whereas now you see we have a lot of online communities as well, like supporting each other, bringing knowledge, bringing, like a lot of resources on know-hows around how to build those structures again. And I think like there is a choice that's been done here by many people. And I don't think we can push that choice on anyone, And unfortunately, I also see that sometimes we need to hit something to really realize and say, oh my God, I need to change my path there, right? And I see all those developing groups, communities, however you want to call it, like as nodes, centers that certainly attract people and give the chance to experience something new, and new ways of living, new ways of being in reciprocity. And it's like I'm saying, like in nature, when you start rebuilding a nice, caring about a watershed, you see the land, the erosion slowing down. You see the land recovering. You see the tree coming back. You see the birds coming back. On the social layer, I see the same happening when that cycle comes back and weaves back. And so we talk a lot about building community of practice. Like wherever you are, one person, 2%, a group of 10, start small where with that and keep activating that center. And right now, again, I'm really seeing we have so many resources, and the practice is really the important thing. We might have even too much right now. There's so much out there. It's amazing, really. When I look at it, like when I started so many years ago, I'm like, wow. It's just that now really being in that practice and the trust layer is huge. It's just saying, okay, I'm gonna really trust in this path. I'm gonna really trust that I'm gonna do that. So again, just Samantha, there's these old practices that for me helps me personally to reconnect with the lineage beyond my blood lineage as humans. It gives me lots of strength when I'm able to connect to that. I'm just like, wow, there's so many people that have done that before me. It's just like connecting to that energy center with that helps me to keep in that energy. And then it's yeah, how do we pull that energy and make it contagious around ourselves? And again, great to be 5 people and be really like doing it,
Thank you, Aude. Beautiful answer.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe for Tyler, like you would ask what like some of the best groups look like, and like even especially like in cities, we've got groups that are saving money together, and they're borrowing that money, and they're creating little markets for paying back those debts in different ways, including with money coming back in. And more rural communities with probably a little bit less money and more pooling of commitments and goods and services. But basically think of like a small little credit union, right? Where the credit union is seeded by the members of the credit union with cash or whatever resources they have. And we just acknowledge cash as a resource. That's it. And just to frame it, like like we can think of cash or national currency as a commitment of the state. And there's a lot of, like the transition path from saying we're at 100% dependency on it right now, or 99% dependency, saying, well, what's the path down to 98% dependency, right? What does that look like? And just be super realistic around where we are right now, and not saying, okay, we're going to go to like 10% dependency on the national currency tomorrow. And so we've seen that transition happening more and more and more in these groups, where like money is still used as a resource within the group, but they're interacting much, much, much more and realizing the abundance of all of the commitments that they can offer themselves, not just the commitment of the state, right? And so the idea of a group pooling resources, and we've also done we've had groups receive basic income or grants or like a Ma Earth and these kind of endowments and stuff like this, or Islamic foundations do endowments into a group like that, so the money can start like that in the group. Sometimes they start without money, but sometimes they start with, and sometimes they start with their own money. When those endowments are coming into those groups, if people are able to borrow from that and they replace what they borrowed with their commitments for goods and services, right? So in a way, you could think of this as like you're refinancing debts, right? So instead of just holding a debt, you're saying the group is going to hold in a little marketplace where they can sell my services now, right, to pay off that debt. I can also be required after 3 months to a year to say I'm going to pay it back with cash if no one's taken out that, right? So a lot of the times we're dealing with just normal groups that do lending, right? Like because they have a lot of understanding around those processes. So like sometimes it's microfinance group, sometimes it's community savings and loan group, sometimes it's mutual funds. We're dealing with bonds, like government bonds in Bhutan. That's a big push there, is to say, well, could government bonds come into these types of networks? So in other words, like seeding a network like this with cash, where people can start borrowing that, they can pay back in kind via marketplace, where people can come in and buy out of that marketplace or trade those debts amongst each other, and then pay back the bond purchasers, right? So whoever invested into those, we can call them bioregions, or village networks and whatnot. And so to me, that's the hybrid where they're dealing with cash and commitments for goods and services, right? It's the mixture of like the seed bank and the cash bank and the goods and service bank, right? All combined together. Those are the most active of the groups that we deal with.
And I'm also seeing, like, same on the book, we will again reshare. We have a process wherever we go on the ground to actually help map and see all that reality. Like it's this, like what we do is an assessment of the different assets that exist in a community. On the social, ecological, infrastructure, economics, we do a big asset mapping with the communities. After that, we do a vision. Like we have individual visions, processes. We have collective vision approaches, and then we see what's needed in between. Like what are the gaps? What's the action planning needed? And most of the time, we should say, what is your vision to 1 year? What's in the vision to 3 years? Depending on really what the group is looking at, and that helps a lot. Is really one powerful thing is just reminding people and ourselves what we actually have, and put that down and do a big map. It's like when you map a landscape, you do the same. You look what's there, you do what's missing, and you look at what you want the landscape to look like in a few years. So again, in our book, we have all those processes that you can apply. And that's what we do when we go to communities. And just like building on that after. And then from there, what are the real commitments that people can, and as soon as there's a collective view on that, then we understand not only what we are committing to, but what everyone is committing to. And that's a really amazing process to see the intentions, the real intentions, and that weaves the trust already into like, oh, okay, that my neighbor here is also doing that. And sometimes we're not even aware of that. And that can happen even in really still close communities, that's like, oh, wow, I was not aware that my neighbor wants to build a shop where I could sell my products, right? And sometimes we go to look for that shop like miles away when it's actually just next door, and we didn't have that communication happen close by where we are. So again, in the book, all that methodology is shared. Yeah.
There's a piece around like casting there too that Aude saying is like, we just don't even know what our neighbors do or offer, or even just their professional work, like what skills they have, and what tools they have, what kind of groups they belong to, or anything like that.
Yeah. And I was seeing on the chat a few things, but I think we'll get to the questions later. But there's one, I see the question of loneliness. That happens. That's completely normal, that suddenly we're like, oh, okay, how do I start? What should I do? There's something that's really amazing and everyone loves is food. Like, make a good potluck. Gather the people, just that, bring food, and you discover each other dishes. Like, so really start with really simple thing, then can really turn out into something you would even not imagine. Just start with something that you can identify everyone loves. Food is a very easy one. And then you have, other organisms, like when it's the beautiful sunny day, go in the park and make the potluck there. And and ask everyone to bring something that they know, that's skilled at. And one will start, I don't know, juggling or sharing a thoughts or a book or whatever, start with really simple things. And it's really about, again, building that trust, reconnecting to each other from a place of finding common grounds.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Thank you. Yeah, I want to build on that. And I'm curious about scale, and I'm curious about complexity. There's a comment in the chat around, is this really most appropriate for small scale agrarian villages, or does it work for massive cities with complex supply chains, building products that, are transported all over and aren't just grown in my yard and I can't just walk to my neighbors? What have you all learned about appropriate scale and appropriate complexity, especially given that you're all very clear about the need for stewardship of these pools, that it takes human labor to ensure that there's accountability, to set the limits on what can be added to the pool, to set the valuation between different things. That takes time, that takes energy. And I'm curious for folks here on the call who might be excited about this and are thinking about, okay, where would I begin? What would you advise on scale and complexity? And do you see this growing into something that becomes a big part of our economy, or do you really imagine it retaining its kind of grassroots essence?
Just first thoughts on that is like a pattern we see really working is that small groups, niche groups that repeat and connects to each other. Like that seems to be way more efficient than suddenly big groups. And again, that will depend on if you already have a group that's functioning and are 50 and function very well in each other and are already in cooperative modes, we need to look at context. But most of the group we work with, like it's about 10 to 20 people that function very well together and then connects to the other groups. And we can apply that to context. You have people that we normally as humans cluster around what we like doing, right? So if there is a group of wood carving groups, or farmer groups, and then you have researcher group, whatever clusters we can imagine, and then it's like where all of that overlaps and can actually work well together. So sometimes it's not about doing big groups to scale, it's actually doing a nice coordination and overlapping systems. And in the commitment pooling, that's also how Will has designed that, is imagining the network. Thank you, Kawe, for sharing in the group the Sarafu network. You have lots of examples of different people in the world using the Sarafu network and showing what they do over the world with that. It's imagining the scaling approach. It's imagining all those overlapping pools where you can exchange when needed in between groups, but you keep focusing on what your main group is actually doing. And if it needs certain resources, suddenly it can connect with those other groups around.
Yeah. Somehow it's like, there's looking at patterns of how we can coordinate resources. And that's it. It's just what are those patterns? How do we look at that as a pattern language? How do we look at curation, valuation, limitation, and exchange as like a piece of a protocol that can be built on, and just look at that from wherever you are and whatever perspective you're in, right? And then we can say, okay, now you want to talk about specific institutionalizing, right? Like you want to say, okay, you're going to actually do what now? So if like you're living in a suburb and you've got tools in your tool shed that you don't use, and you want to make your neighbors aware that they can use them, but you want to create like a credit system between that where they're also willing to lend out stuff in their own house, and you want to create a little database around that and share it with your other neighbors and start building that out. Like, okay, so we can talk about those institutional steps of what you would need to do, or you as a group of neighbors would need to do once that gets larger and larger scale, right? So I want to separate those two things out, because otherwise we're always confused as to what is the institutional step depending on the context versus what is the pattern, right? Like, are we looking for, in general, ways to coordinate our resources together to all reach our visions together? What does that look like? What visions? How would we know what resources are there? So like, I think it's really important to separate those two things out. Otherwise, commitment pooling then just becomes another brand. Like, oh, we're doing mutual credit now. We're doing commitment pooling. It's like, well, what does that mean? Exactly. And it's just like we see that pattern happening. We do a lot of work, learning with Aude on ecology. It was like, how are those guilds of 5 plants actually sharing resources together? I don't know exactly, and we're learning about that, and it's fun and it's exciting. And so, like, if that's interesting to you, and there's a term, I can't remember it. It was something like a type of nerd in Japanese. It's like Fei of Kotanuma. I don't know. You'll see it in a article I'm working on about Japanese nerds right now. But there's this thing around like nerding out around coordination systems, around how living systems work together, and just being like, whoa, interesting. Like how does that work? What kind of patterns can we find within living systems where they coordinate resources? Like, wow, cool. Versus now he's saying, okay, like in Bhutan, for instance, we are coming in with the government, and they're basically saying this village, which has these administrators in the village, they're going to run a small community credit union, like a bank, right? And the community is going to interact with that bank in the way, because they were getting bank loans before, so they want to sort of localize those more into the village, and they want to make those more like the traditions that they're used to, right? So it's called Latsab in Bhutan, which is like a rotational labor type tradition, and it's very, super, super ancient. And so they're trying to sort of like Latsab-ize more of their resources, including money, so that they end up in less stagnant debt. And you say, okay, well, great. At an institutional layer now, you have an administrative unit that has like we use blockchain a lot, so they have a multi-signature way of making decisions. So they'll do a consensus layer, and then 4 out of 5 people have to sign to allow different people into that network, and they would set, how much credit limits does everyone get. And ideally, almost all of our work is just to go into what they're already doing. So, that's sort of the low hanging fruit for us, is like, if they're already familiar with savings and loan or rotational labor systems, it's like, well, what rules would you normally use? I mean, you guys are probably all familiar with like credit cards and banks somehow. Well, what are those rules? How do they loan you stuff? How would you ever get a lease on a car? How does it work? Right? What are you used to, in other words? And usually we're just going into that. It's like, okay, great. That's the world you're used to in dealing with that. You do borrow stuff from people or banks or whoever. How does that work for you right now? Right? And a lot of what she was saying, and with Tyler as well, you were asking as well about like, what does this look like? And it was, you were saying that as these things connect to each other. And so that's a lot of what we're trying to do, is just find the pattern and then broadcast that pattern, right? And not, it doesn't have to be at all layers. Like, you can have a consensus layer just among your group, but if you do start broadcasting to a larger network, right? Your whole bioregion or your whole neighborhood, right? Then all of a sudden, everyone can see what resources are available. Right? Everyone can see that they can potentially have credit within those systems. Everyone starts having transparency around those systems. And to me, that's, like there's a real famous example that happened in Slovenia. It's still going on. I think it was called Tetris. And Leanne would know about it a lot. And Thomas Fleischman was part of this. And basically what they did was they got all the businesses, like 60,000 businesses in the country, to start broadcasting unpaid invoices. That's it. And they had a national database, right? And all of a sudden they could start doing clearing among them. It's like, oh, Tyler owes Will owes Pedro, and Pedro owes Tyler, right? And so you could close off that circle, right? And you can create clearing among that. And so like that level of broadcasting of what's available in communities, what kind of debts there are, in communities, and how those can be cleared, as we start scaling in that way, once we find a safe way to broadcast, just like we're broadcasting right now, right? TCP/IP is a basic protocol for exchanging information on the internet, right? Well, what is our basic protocol when we notice these patterns, we're broadcasting all these goods and services within a bioregion. And then now what can we do? Now that we've found a safe way to broadcast, and we're broadcasting from curated marketplaces, right? Curated networks. And so the concept of curation market is really important to me. I say it a lot because it's like, how do you know what to value? And so if that curation market is broadcasting something and there's a connection to another curation market and another one over here, you can create networks among those. And so that's what I see. I mean, and we talk to, our neighbors going, and they talk about their great grandparents and whatnot, and like, what did these pools of resources and these traditions, how did they connect to each other across from village to clan, all the way out to a whole tribe? What did that look like? And somehow, you would end up with curation markets around grandmas, So you imagine like this grandma is the abuela that's saying, yeah, that's my trusted uncle over there. And okay, yeah, you can marry his brother over there. And, like you end up with those connections between trusted networks. And I think that's what we're trying to sort of bring out more and more. And that's what we start seeing happening more and more. So like as one group starts to broadcast this stuff, well, they're connected to another network. And so there can be credit moving between those networks. Yeah.
I like when, Willa started to talk about debt, credit and debt more and more lately. And for me, it's really like shifted something. It's, like for me as a memory, debt is shame, like if you ask for money because you don't have it, therefore you don't have enough. There's a kind of scarcity kind of mindset around debt and credit, whereas that way as looking at it is abundant. It's like, yes, we want that. We want to be owning in each other. And that's a Kickstarter for reciprocity. And I really like that. At least to me, it really shifted something in the way I'm like, yeah, let's make it transparent. Let's really see what we owe to each other and bring abundance from there. I really like that. Yeah.
Wonderful. All this is getting so rich. So I am going to propose that we shake it up a little bit and just do a very quick 5-minute breakout. Folks will be in groups of 3, and we'll have about 5 minutes together. And I really encourage you all to just collectively tune into 1, what are you learning in this session here? And 2, what are you most curious about? And when we come back, we'll try to source all those curiosities and try to refine a couple last questions for Will and Aude before we wrap. And so I think Carla should have those rooms ready. And if you're busy doing the dishes and you can't speak, that's fine. Just stay on mute in your room, but we'll be back here soon. Thanks for that, everyone. And thank you to Carla for rescuing those who might have been stranded in a dark breakout room by themselves. Would love folks to put in the chat sensations that you were feeling, things you've been learning, and things you're curious about. And with all of those coming in, especially those curiosities, I'll try to synthesize into a couple questions. And if you've already typed up a question, I'll be tracking those too and trying to pull those in. Thanks so much for contributing the way you all are. While those messages are coming in the chat, I wanted to ask you, Aude, about something we talked about on a prior call, which I heard from you as kind of this inherent relationship that can be there between ecosystem restoration and regeneration and the formation of these commitment pools. Could you share more about what those processes look like and ways that these pools can be designed to explicitly be focused on ecological regeneration?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, so like we mentioned before, I'm going to go to the case where we live in Kenya. We have a little community center that's also a demo farm. We are showing like syntropic agroforestry systems, conservation of a little forest as well, building on water systems. We're in coastal areas, so there's a lot of water issues, water availabilities, different season. And we work with a network of 100 neighbors and farmers. And again, something I've seen working very well is having demo farms in terms of showing how ecosystem restoration, watershed restoration, bioregional restoration can work. You can then adapt to a scale. It's really having a place that's focused on community. Also, where it's a learning space where you can show and people can see through time how nature cycles, when well taken care of, just come back to life. And in our case, so we are connected to 100 neighbors. It's been 3 years now that we've set up that center and that demo farm. And so what we are seeing happening is that naturally people are bringing back those practices to their own houses, because as they have a place to actually practice it, do it, and see the changing through times, and we are in a space that's not anyone's house. We're not telling anyone what to do. I think this is really important. You really need to understand by learning, by seeing. And then we are seeing the work replicate around us in a village scale, like in hundreds of hectares around, in a very organic and natural way. And that's also what the commitment pooling system allows. It's like we go back to nature cycles. We go back to nature rhythms. It's a rhythm that's not, I come, I put money in as a foundation, and I tell all my neighbors what to do in their land. If we come and do that, they'll do it. But will they really do it because they've chosen to do it? And same with nature. So for me, I can't even disconnect it. The socio-ecology side of it, it's really strongly connected. You cannot disconnect humans' cycles to nature cycles. And commitment pooling is, in essence, is that, So then it's like allowing this understanding of, okay, now I've seen that, and I've seen that so many times repeating as a pattern. You see, you understand, that's it. It takes, in that case, it has taken us like 3 years to see some people say, I want to design my land with swales, and I'm so glad I didn't do that the first year, because I know that now they're asking it because they really want to do it and see the improvements. So again, that's another mindset on how fast we want to do things. Sometimes we want to do things very fast, and the project, they just collapse because people didn't have time to really understand and have the capacity to maintain it. They got the skills, they got the training, but they didn't really believe in what they were doing. In that case, in that case, the process is really different, and the trust building as a rhythm. And sometimes we want to rush these processes, and it just doesn't work. And so it again, it's a lot of listening, same as you listen to a land. So that's the first layer of it. And then the second layer is, again, like as we pull resources, economical resources sometimes, or trainings, or it's now through the commitment pooling system, we have a way, and we've been super successful in that sense with different funders that have supporting us, because we've shown a model that's able to just not work when there's a training or support at some point, but make it continue through time. And the commitment pooling allows that, because there's already a system that knows how to work without resources, with what we have. And that has been super powerful for us, even with the Red Cross. You were mentioning we worked with the Red Cross, which are they normally like put some input at some point, and that tends to stop there. Whereas through the commitment pooling, it circles back and back and back, and that helps to go through the next stage. And then with the visionary approach and all the asset mapping that we do continuous cycles on that, on how we get back to our vision, where we are at now, and what's the next step, what's the next project, what's your next development in your farms, in the village, or so
I was going to add something about like the listening stuff. There's this point of, like for listening to landscapes and whatnot, but in terms of building trust with people, and I saw a question on the chat around trust as well. It's like, most of what I think brings out people's ability to express their needs and what their resources are and their vision is games, like play. And if you can fail in front of someone, if there can be like open play, then you get a lot of opening up that you just don't get otherwise. And like I can't imagine, like a lot of the environments we're in, like it's not a set up environment where I can work on someone's shadow side or something like that. It's not that environment. But if there's play involved, so like we do a lot of games. Like most of our work in communities is all game based, right? So all resource mapping, total game based. Looking at relative connections to each other. We look at, we do like thread games and all kinds of stuff. We do games where we do like barter and pooling. Like we do physical versions of everything, and we don't need to, a lot of groups more and more and more, we're not going digital at all, right? We're just actually using little ledgers and cards, and you can actually play through all that stuff and play through the examples. And the more often you're doing that kind of play work, the more people really get it. And there's, like that iteration process. So to me, there's something about listening and playing that goes together,
Yeah.
Awesome. The play got some big celebration in the chat. Thanks for that.
Yes.
And yeah, just want to uplift the book. The last section of the book, it offers a lot of exercises that you can do in your community and different games to try out. And so on that thread, I imagine there's a handful of folks here who are fired up about this and they want to try it out. There's a lot of folks on this call who are actively working on bioregional financing facilities in their own places, and maybe they got inspired by that bond example. They're not a nation state, but maybe there's something interesting to play there. Where should people go when they have questions? Is there a community of the different pools that are exchanging lessons and starting to figure out how to mesh together and do that inter-pool exchange? How do folks plug into that? How do they get guidance from others who are on this journey?
Yeah. We've got a support Substack group that's probably the most active on that. There's some links there. info@grassecon.org maybe again is good for emails.
And we also had like community of practice groups that now we are not doing, but we used to do it, and we are thinking about a new actually concepts, because we have more and more like demand from outside, and we want to do that as efficient as we can. And we are thinking about rebuilding a community of practice online, and that the requirements is really like come up with your projects. Like, coming up with your project, coming up with your concrete reality. What are you doing already, so that we really get into actionable steps. So we are refining a way to retake those were bi-weekly or weekly?
Just have weekly ones.
Weekly ones, yeah. So we'll see if you do weekly or bi-weekly. We need to reorganize a bit and probably after baby is coming as well, we'll have a little bit more time, and we're thinking through that. But that's something we are thinking to relaunch those group, to support, because we try to build content that can be applied without us as much as we can. So we're constantly updating how to do that best, and how to have people just implement, because that's really what we want.
I've got a few like little video games on that little play thing that's meant to just like get people into pattern recognition around resource coordination. So I stuck a link there, and then I've got another game that's coming out that'll be like a multiplayer game where you do everyone has ingredients and you're all trying to make recipes together, and it's super dumb but fun and silly. And so just more of that kind of like, how would kids just have that instinct to say, oh right, like these people have these things that they offer, these people have these things that they need. How would you put those in relationship to each other so that everyone's happy and having their visions met? And just what's that curriculum look like, and that instinct look like, and building it up, and thinking about kids obviously a lot right now, and just kinesthetic learning, like putting blocks together. You'll see some of these games where I'm just doing like very stupid little kinesthetic stuff, and but I you sort of get feels for it. I'll keep iterating on those. I think it's fun for me as well, because as I do it, I think through a lot of like, edge cases and whatnot of like what's happening when everyone just wants peanut butter, like, okay, well, we've got issues now. And so yeah.
And
Awesome.
yeah, we're so super happy. Like, and again, like we need to do that. But if we were to come to the States and have also an in-presence, like workshop that could benefit many groups at the same time. Like again, we really want to make our time as efficient as we can, and finding a good formula for that would be also amazing. Like to say, what are the groups? We briefly mentioned that with you previously, Tyler and Samantha, and that would be great. You already have a curated groups, people that are already engaged, so that would be amazing. That could have like an effect on different groups to really integrate that methodologies. And after training, you're actually able to just do it, and with all the supports of the books and the games and everything. And the more you prepare for it, then it can really just go quick into action.
Neat. Yeah, we're excited to follow that thread with you and see what it might be like to organize some sort of gathering that brings different bioregions together to play with this.
Yeah.
Just want to invite anyone to raise their hand, either digitally or visually, if you're having a hard time finding the button, to ask any burning questions. I think Will and Aude have been doing a great job of tending to the chat, and we've been trying to weave in some of those themes in our questions. So I'll ask one last question, but would love any audience members to raise a hand if you have something burning. There was a question early on that was asking for some clarification around, what's the difference between this and a time bank? And so I'm pasting that question in. They say, how is it similar, different, or a hybrid? If someone can issue an IOU in exchange for help, do the IOUs have different face values on them the way a currency does? Or is the point to keep the value undefined and let the relationship decide what counts as repayment? This is something we started to chat about in our breakout room as well, around when does the kind of reductionist putting numbers on things start to show up. And so I feel like those themes are intertwined here. And my guess is also where things might break down or where conflict starts to show up is around that valuation layer. And so would love to hear you all speak to how that looks like in practice and how this might break down if there's not the right support around it.
And maybe I could just add on that to ask if you all could say something about efficiency and maybe trade-offs between efficiency and resilience in this case.
Okay, so like the oldest version that I talked to my neighbors about what they did as kids or way back in time, like if you have a bunch of people, let's say it's the end of a harvest season, so it's time to harvest, and you've asked your neighbors to come. Usually they're like banging a stick, saying it's like my turn to borrow from the community, to ask for help. And so like everything's generally done relative to the value of a day's worth of labor in that case. But people would also come and not do a day's worth of labor, but they would bring maybe porridge, or they would bring, if they're building something, like a granary, they would bring mud or sticks or something like this, and they would have a system of relative value for those things. So like the size of a gourd of container would would have a value relative to a day's worth of labor, right? So that gourd, so they would have basically what we kind of consider is kind of like a price index, essentially, is what you have, right? If you stocked a vending machine, you said what's the relative value of all these things to each other, right? On a scale, they would have that relative scale, and you can kind of think of that as like a vector. It's like pointing in the value direction that they care about in space. And what we do mostly now, and time could be one of those things too. So like a day's worth of labor would be measured in, probably more, not time exactly, but maybe like energy, energy used, like kilowatt hours, right? And probably some with a quality measurement as well, right? It wasn't, you just didn't do jumping jacks all day, right? And so there would be some way that the community was dealing with that. And there would be a group that was their job. And like there's a thing, there's the rotational labor tradition going on. But then there's also these dome traditions, which would be just gatherings, making decisions like that. And those would also be rotational. So you would have a rotational gathering where it's not like one person's in charge, but there's a rotational kind of like council that's basically saying, okay, what's going on? Do we need to deal with problems that happened, last week and whatnot? How do we value these things this month? Because things would change also all the time, right? Like during different seasons, they would value things differently. So that idea of having kind of your price index of what you value. So how much do you value an hour's worth of labor compared to a bucket of apples? And that might be really, really hard to measure right now, a priori, like if you have no idea. And so usually what we're doing with communities that are, at their 99%, totally needing national currency, and they value things in the national currency market, usually we're starting at shilling or dollar value of product, right? And because we're often dealing with money loans in these things as well, right? So we say, look, Gerald is offering, car fixing or driving services, right? So this is dollars worth of those. So in other words, if Gerald, let's say he's borrowing from the community and he wants to borrow $50 worth of money in the community, or he wants to borrow $50 worth of Aude services, right? So he borrows those $50. He puts in his $50 worth of mechanic services into the pool, right? He uses those $50 as a discount on Aude services. And maybe she charges $100 for landscaping, okay? So he got a $50 off landscaping. Great. Now he's in debt to the group. So his $50 worth of mechanic services is in the group. And to do a oil change costs $60 or whatever it is these days, right? And so somebody comes in and says, I'm willing to buy that or trade some other services for that $50. And I'm going to use that $50 of, to get my oil changed at Gerald's. And I might add another $10 to that as well. So that vector now, that price list is usually just 1. You're starting with $1 worth. Everyone's dollar is worth $1 worth at market value of national currency, right? I don't know if that makes sense, but basically it's just, like you're basically saying that her dollar of consulting hours is worth your dollar of anything else, right? And that's a nice place to start because it's how we already understand the market we're in, right? And then what a community can do with these pools is they can start to diverge from that. We say, okay, no, we want to make daycare more valuable now, right? And so this is generally what I like doing, is going into communities and saying, okay, how do you price stuff right now? How do you do your loans? Great, let's start there, right? And then we can start diverging from that as we want and as we need to seasonally and whatnot. And that to me is like, I don't have to deal with units of account. We're not creating new currencies or anything like that off the bat. But what eventually happens is you create your own vector, your own sort of, how do we value things in this community? And it might be different than the next community over there.
And I'm seeing in the chat, like, how do you manage imbalances in types of services? So in that case, if you say you have lots of offer of massage and gardening, but little for car repair, look for car repair to bring into that group, and maybe you bring those massage people offering massage into another group, and they build another group with other resources. Sometimes it's good to fork like that, so you actually create more meaningful little groups than just one where it's gonna get stuck. So yeah, and then it's again about looking for what is actually needing, and better to be 5 people with different offers in that sense.
Would you say, Aude, that every group needs diversity and shared vision to function well?
Yeah, well, it helps. Otherwise, we again in the in the only gardening and massage at some point. Right? Okay.
Sounds so, like a pretty nice place, but
and I mean, it can be really fun. I mean, there's a lot. Spend our time like that.
Can't get anywhere in the car though.
We've worked with youth groups where every single person is a motorcycle operator, right? Like it's literally a group. It's like a bike gang, right? And they all say, oh, we all do motorcycle services. And so usually what we do is like, okay, what are your visions? You know, we do this resource mapping, and we start getting into like, what else can you do? Do you cook? You know, what else is in your group? And just, you know, a little bit of games and challenging people. And in that said, a group of people who are curating biking services that offer guarantees on that, that's a valuable curated marketplace for bike services. It actually is really valuable. And so even if everyone in the group, even if they're all offering massage, well, if that's something that I can buy into, it means that like I can get a coupon out of that pool that I can exchange for any other massage services that are all being curated as the best massage services in that area. Like that's actually a really cool thing. Curation markets are amazing, actually.
Yeah.
like they
And then it will depend on the demand in that specific,
Yeah.
you know, like suddenly, a cluster of masseuses can be amazing if the demand is huge and you actually want a really good curation. In that case,
yeah. And
that's another
and then kind of like as things scale out, the idea is that you've got, you know, like, yeah, fine, you've got a massage pool, someone's curating that, and they find it's valuable for everyone because the massage guys are getting marketing that way. Clients are finding easy ways to get consulting massage hours from whatever. And then you have another pool, you know, nearby where there's a crossover. And so you could actually have your massage hours that you've bought there that are actually tradable into another pool. And that's where we get this routing systems going on. And that's really what like Visa and MasterCard are. They're just routing debts through a whole bunch of banks. What we're trying to do is just saying, forget the banks. Everybody's a bank in that sense. Everyone can curate resources. Every community, every village, every bioregion has the ability to curate resources. And we can route credit through that entire network as long as it's being broadcast in some way.
Mm-hmm. So fun. Thank you for your decades of learning and experimentation and service and listening, and for sharing that all with us here and in all your writings. And we look forward to journeying with you. I just want to say a brief word about some upcoming events in this community of practice. We have our next deep dive with Stefan Martineau, who is developing a very comprehensive vision around regenerative economic zones that we think could synergize very beautifully with commitment pooling. So we hope to see lots of you there. We've shared the link to the BioFi community of practice on Hilo in our calendars, so folks can find us there. It's been a real honor to have you both here, Will and Aude. If there's any final words you want to offer, feel free, and then we'll wrap up.
Hopefully we'll have a brand new like a open source app out that'll be like a native app you can use on your phone to play around and do some of the stuff. Like we're slowly retiring Sarafu Network, which has been our bastion for years and years, but it's kind of become a spaghetti monster. And so we're making a very clean, sleek version of this that people can copy and so on the software side anyways. But I would say don't let the software hold you back. And you know, there's a lot of work well before you get to software, and a lot of community groups doing this stuff on paper is brilliant.
Yeah, all our work is also open source. What we want is just really people doing it, you know, applying it, doing it, and we try to answer as much and as best as we can to the questions we have. That's why we also publish a lot of information, articles, and we try to just broadcast ourselves as much as we can. And so super happy to follow up with anyone here. And thank you so much, Tyler, Samantha, for all this amazing curation work you do. That's a lot, and that's really amazing. And thank you for bringing everyone here today. It's been a pleasure to spend this time with you all.
Thank you, Aude.
Wonderful.
Thank you, Will. Blessings on welcoming your new baby to the world. Hope you get some good time off.
Yeah.
And we'll be in touch, and we'll let folks know when Aude and Will are hopefully in North America before too long.
Yeah, should be
awesome.
Yeah. Sometime next year.
Cool. Feel free to come off mute and say farewell. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank
Ciao,
you.
ciao.
Ciao.
Everyone.
Bye.